the first time, knowing she got to stand up here and read that. I'm sure was super excited to be, oh, goody, I get to read a story about hell and people in agony. And it was actually kind of amusing over at Bellevue First. They have this practice where for the scripture reading and the call to worship, they actually just have it printed on a page. And when somebody walks in, they take it upon themselves to just take the sheet of paper and be liturgist. And just out of curiosity, I was watching that table where it is, and like 3 or 4 people picked it up and read it and set it back down and went and took a seat. So you didn't even have that chance, surely. You just had to be brave and wrestle with it. So when I was in high school, I think I was, 16-ish, 17 years age, there was a pair of girls who, for some reason, were very worried about me going to hell. And I am not sure why they were so worried, because I was mostly tame as a teenager, as teenagers go. I mean, I wasn't violent to anybody. I wasn't evil. I wasn't mean. But they tried and tried to get me to go to their church and their youth group. And the reason they gave was concern for my everlasting soul and where it would end up. And had they just told me there would be like good brownies there, I probably would have gone. But they were always just very concerned that I would end up in hell. Yeah. Now, there are things, I will admit, from that time in my life that I am not proud of. I am not proud of my fashion sense from that day and age, and I'm not proud of the haircut that I often wore, which there shall never be photographic evidence presented here of those days of my life. I'm not proud that I didn't always trust my parents' guidance, nor was I always honest with my parents. But I imagine I was a fairly typical teenager in that sense. I don't know too many teenagers who are excited to tell their parents everything and trust their guidance. I mean, we tend to rebel at that age a little bit. So there's things I'm not proud of, but looking back, I am proud of a couple of things. And one of the major things is that I had friends in every group that was in the high school. I went to a big high school, like 2,000 some students. So my class alone was 500, 600 people. I mean, it was pretty large. And I had made space, and this was pretty intentional, with all sorts of different people. I was friends with the jocks. I was kind of one of them. I was a soccer player, but I had friends who were wrestlers and baseball players and basketball players and track people and all of that. I was friends with the stoners and that crowd. I was friends with people who were in the jazz band and the marching band. I was friends with people who were on the newspaper and the people who got far better grades than I did. I mean, like, I was friends with them all. I didn't really have one group that I stuck with. And for somebody who didn't go through their teenage years super gracefully, looking back, I'm proud that for some reason I just valued people and enjoyed getting to know them for who they were. And it's interesting looking back that there was those 2 girls who were so focused on my afterlife that they weren't really looking, I feel like now, at how I lived my day to day, because I tended to be kind and patient with people, and I just think it's interesting. So today we are absolutely unequivocally talking about heaven and hell. The Progressive Church, of which you are one, I will tell you, even if you don't know that you are, often likes to pretend that Jesus never talked about hell, which isn't true. The Conservative Church would have you think that Jesus only talked about hell, which is also untrue. He talked about it a couple times. Today is one of the examples of him talking about heaven and hell. But that is not all he talked about. In fact, it is a rarity among all the things he talked about. Do we know, just as an aside, what he talked about more than anything else when it came to his teachings and prescriptions and warnings and all of that? Any guesses? Well, yes, but in particular, he talked about money and wealth more than any other subject. So just let that simmer a little bit. So looking at today, looking at this text, number one, it's not the same Lazarus as who appears later. Just the same name. Just like there's lots of Maries and lots of riches around this church. Just same name. Two, as we established, he's definitely talking about hell and heaven. And three, yes, there are parts to this story that make somebody who's squeamish really squirm. There's a couple sentences in there that are unpleasant but necessary, because they establish the seriousness of what this story is about, this text. When there's that line in there about Lazarus was so destitute and so sick and so impoverished that the dogs licked the sores. Like, it's disgusting, but it tells us exactly how bad things were. Mostly though, this text asks us, I think, a profoundly important question that is extraordinarily important for all of us gathered here today. And it's a question that I feel like has often been ignored for a lot of the last couple thousand years, at least in certain traditions. So the question is Jesus' focus on what happens after we die in this text? Or is he asking, how do we respond to people who are living in hell? That's the central question. Is he asking us to think about what happens when this earthly life ends? Or is he really talking about the relationships we have, the decisions we make, the way we use our resources, the plight of our neighbor? So here's a question. Who would we say is living in hell today? And this is a genuine question, so shout out your answer. Who would we say is, pardon? Politicians. Who? Politicians? Yeah, or are they living in hell or creating it? That might be the question. But a little bit of both, right. Who's living in hell today? Well, I'm not talking about afterlife. I'm talking about conditions today. God, people in Gaza. Absolutely. People at the border, absolutely.
People I see on the street in downtown Seattle.
Absolutely. Think about for a minute, and again, I don't mean to be like grotesque or anything like that, but think about what it must feel like. Number one, to not know where you're going to sleep, if you're safe when you sleep, not knowing where your next meal is going to come from, but where you can use the bathroom in a humane, safe, sanitary way. I mean, if that's not a bit hellish, I don't know what is. Who else do we know that has some hell in their life today? People in abusive relationships who don't know how to leave, don't know if they can leave. People who are deeply impoverished of all sorts of ways. People who are being bullied, yeah. Which happens in all ages, by the way. It's not just a school thing. Yeah. People with mental health issues who don't have access to health care or loving communities or any of that, absolutely. And can be hellish even if you have all of that. Yeah. People with Alzheimer's? Or their caregiver. That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those whose lives are touched and impacted by violence. So today's text, I would argue, and I would stand up here to the end of my days, that this text is less about hell and more about Jesus challenging and unsettling and resetting people's thoughts about themselves and their relationships. Because in this text, we have this incredible reversal taking place that Jesus loves to do in a lot of his teachings and parables and things like that, where he'll take something that's genuinely accepted as true and right in the way things are, and he'll flip it around and hopefully get people to go, I got to think something new now. Which is part of why he said on more than one occasion, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. Right. I mean, that was him just kind of spelling it out. But we have in this text a flip-flop that's meant to challenge the status quo, and the status quo in our minds for us and for the hearers of the day. And so we have this poor ailing man, Lazarus, and we are told that he is carried up to be with Abraham, carried up to the good place of honor by angels. Now, it would not have been uncommon in that day and even today for people to look at somebody whose life was a mess and think that that was God's judgment, right? That surely this person had sinned or done something wrong or made a bunch of bad choices and was right where he probably deserved to be. God did not care for that person, did not bless that person. And yet in this text, that person is carried up, escorted by the angels to be with Abraham. And then we had the rich man, counterpoint, who many back then, and I would argue many today, would think had God's favor, had wealth and privilege, wearing purple, when we know that purple is a sign of royalty, wealth, privilege, and all of that stuff. And yet this person who had all of that ends up in the bad place, ends up in Hades. And just to highlight how unpleasant this isn't just like, oh, these shoes are a little uncomfortable kind of unpleasant. It's so unpleasant, so torturous for the rich man that he asked the poor man, who was covered in sores previously, the definition of unclean, to just dip his finger in the water and give him some. I mean, he was desperately thirsty, in agony. Again, unsettling imagery, but it's meant to highlight the power of this story. The setting of this story, and it is a parable, is it really the afterlife? Is that the focus? That's the question. Or is it really about life and how we're living it? And it's asking, are we guilty of being so concerned about our eternal destination rather than being concerned about our neighbors? And I will say, I will sing your praises as Pacific Northwest churches, is that you don't seem quite as obsessed with heaven and hell as a lot of other churches. Now, the theology does appear in some places, but coming from the southern United States like I do, I would venture that at least 60 or 70% of the sermons that are being preached there right now have something to do with hell. About something to do with not going to the bad place so you can get into the good place. And I will point out that even the founder of United Methodism, John Wesley, was not immune from that theology of trying to avoid the bad place. And one of his catchphrases that he used many times in his sermons and all of that stuff was, "Flee the wrath to come." And I don't know why I said that in a southern accent. He was British. Jack, yell out, "Flee the wrath to come." And it sounded like this. Flee the wrath to come. There we go. Thank you. It sounded like that, probably a little louder, though. So, nicely done. So even in our own tradition, we have this this thread of avoiding the bad place. That's what religion is about. And isn't that a big problem? Think about it. Isn't worrying about, or isn't having as the primary focus of our Christian faith being what happens to our soul when we die? Isn't that sort of selfish? Limiting? Yeah. Isn't it strange that nearly everything Jesus taught and embodied constantly said, how are things with your neighbor? How's it with that person? How's it with that person? And yet somehow, in many churches, and even through our own tradition, the point of faith has been to get ourselves into heaven. Isn't that strange? Isn't that troubling? Because there's something deeply ironic and kind of disturbing that the Christian life being taught as self-centered and self-serving. Look at this text. This text isn't just about heaven and hell and how to get there and who gets there. It paints a picture of God. And it's a beautiful picture. It's almost startling because this story is filled with so many intense, kind of disturbing, almost grotesque passages. And yet the picture that it paints of God is gorgeous and beautiful because it paints a picture of God who isn't playing favorites. God doesn't care if you have wealth or status or any of that. And in fact, in this passage, God doesn't send anyone to hell. What it's trying to say, in many ways, is that we send ourselves. Hell is a separation, a state of being apart that's not dependent on time or life or death. Pope John Paul II said, hell is not a place. It's a state of being. And in that, hell can be present in people's lives today. And as we listed earlier, there are plenty of people for whom their daily existence is hellish. But interestingly, this is also telling us that heaven is present today. And I will say, there were some moments yesterday in Terry Patrick's celebration of life that struck me as having that beautiful something of heaven. For those who weren't here, it's not a secret that Terry struggled with mental health and depression and wasn't always the easiest person to be with. Didn't always respond to her friends, wasn't always easy for her family. And yet the story that was told yesterday was of a group of people, a family and a faith family and a group of friends who were devoted to her and patient with her and loved her. And if that doesn't have a little shade of heaven in it, I don't know what does. So today's text is a reminder that heaven and hell isn't just our destination in the afterlife. It's a state of being that we choose here and now. I think Jesus is actually kind of saying the door to heaven is wide open, so wide that even somebody like Lazarus can come right in. But it's up to us to step through. And we don't step through, we don't open the doors to heaven with obsessive personal piety, which is part of what's been taught in Christianity for far too long. But those doors open and we step through when we have right relationship, when we choose to love others and care for others, And didn't Jesus model this? Didn't he embody this by how he spent his days? He wasn't concerned what others thought of him. He worked on the Sabbath. He healed on the Sabbath. He ate with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes. It wasn't about piety. It was about love. And as we love, as he showed us what that love does, it creates heaven as it is on earth, or earth as it is in heaven. Got that backwards, speaking of the flip-flop. So this story that is so easy for us to think is about hell is actually about life. It's very much about life. It's about our lives. It's about the lives of the people who live next door to us and the people who are in the pews next to us and that we're next to standing in line at QFC. It is very much about wealth and stewardship, isn't it? And I think one of the profound lessons from today is it asks us, what can we do? What will we do with all that we have been blessed with so that there's a little bit more grace and peace in heaven for people today? It's about choices. You see, God has already chosen all of us. Every last one of us. Even the folks you don't like. Even the folks I don't like. Even the folks who vote in a way we don't like. That's a hard one. Every person, every single person is loved by God. We have been chosen and named as beloved. And I think this is what those two girls in high school did not understand. That God already loved me. And God already loved them. God has chosen us all. The real question is, what will we choose? Will we be truly present today? Will we choose to care for our neighbors? Will we choose to love our enemies? Will we turn our focus and stewardship and resources on others? Will we live and create hell or heaven? The choice, Jesus points out, is up to us.